All right. Then it's up to me. My name is. I'm just waiting for the recording to start. Yes, hi everyone. My name is Jens Oscar Nielsen. I have the pleasure of welcoming you today to this call where we have an hour together. I know a lot more people who have wanted to join but haven't been able to, and that's why we're actually recording the call here so that we can share it with our colleagues afterwards across Europe. So my name is Jens. I'm the president of Rugby in Denmark. I'm also on the board of directors of Rugby Europe, and finally, I'm actually on the I'm chairing up the development subcommittee, which is one of the committees working under Rugby Europe. I have the pleasure here today to introduce to you Phil Kearns and also Mark Saltmars, who are from RFU, and I think you guys will give a more in-depth introduction in a second. We're really pleased that you will allocate some time for us here and spend an hour with us and our unions to give us your perspectives or RFU perspectives on the experience you've had when it comes to return to play. And of course, with specific focus today on the coaching side. So much appreciated that you will allocate this time to us here, and I hope we're going to have some fruitful discussions here during this hour. So the program is basically that we have about 45 minutes presentation by you guys and followed by a 15-minute Q&A, and I think we will invite people to write questions or comments in the chat forum. But I think I'm going to hand over to my two colleagues from Rugby Europe here, Phil and sorry, before I give the word to you guys, Phil and Mark, I'm going to hand over the word here to my two colleagues from Rugby Europe, David and Daniel, who will give a more in-depth introduction to some housekeeping rules and also how we're going to run the chat and the Q&A at the end. But again, much appreciated that you will spend an hour with us here, Phil and Mark, and I'm going to just give the word to my two colleagues and then there's over to you guys. So thanks a lot.
Good evening, everybody. My name is David Birdsmith. I'm Corporate Affairs Manager at Rugby Europe. I will just take a minute of your time to do a bit of house cleaning before the actual start of the webinar. So if it's not already done, please mute your microphone. As Jens said, at the end of the session, there will be a 15-minute Q&A session. If asked by the speakers, you will then be able to activate your microphone and ask your question. Otherwise, you can just ask your questions using the chat features of the Microsoft Teams. You can either activate or deactivate your video. The speakers will be in spotlight mode. Yes, as I said, if during the presentation a question comes to your mind, please feel free to use the chat feature to submit it. We'll try to answer to all of the questions, but should we run short of time, we'll provide you with an answer in writing. Please note that the slide that will be used today will be circulated to all participants after the webinar. And as Jens said, the meeting will be recorded and shared with all Rugby Europe members. It's pretty much it for the house cleaning. So I wish you all a very good webinar.
Nothing to add from my side. Just starting the course. I'm just excited to see how we can have new information, new knowledge from our colleagues from England. So let's go.
Thanks, Daniel, David, Jens. I'm going to kick off. I will just share my screen so I can put the slides up. Hopefully that's coming up for everyone. Can we see that okay? Thumbs up? Yeah, great. Okay, good, thank you. So as per the introduction, thanks guys. We're focusing today on coaching and coaches in particular around return to rugby. Myself and Phil are going to talk you through. Just I think if we probably introduce ourselves first, and then we could get into it. I met I think everyone last week on the call where we focused on players. My role as player pipeline manager is particularly related to the age grade, game and education. So in our schools, colleges and universities, and how we can make sure we've got the pipeline of players coming through that part of the game into our clubs and those players become adult players of the future. And I've worked really closely with Phil over the last 18 months, 2 years, as we try and meet this challenge of what do we do to support our coaches in all those different areas of the game to be able to help people to get back playing again. And I'll cover a little bit of the context that we talked through last week, and from a coaching perspective, and some of the things that Dave talked about as well that have become, I guess, some of the key things that we're needing to think about as coaches to help our players with in their return as well. Phil, over to you.
Thanks, Mark, and welcome everyone. Nice to be here and sort of engage and hopefully learn from yourselves as much as share some of our sort of challenges that we face and how we overcome some of those throughout the last 12 to 18 months. My role is coach development manager. And my responsibilities there is just got a message popped up. My responsibilities are really around developing coaches throughout our award programs, so our coaching qualifications, right the way from the performance end of the game through to the grassroots coaches, and providing appropriate coach development opportunities for those coaches to support them in being sure that they can provide the best quality of experience. Our sort of vision that we're hoping to do is provide excellent coaching for every player every time is what we try and work to, and we try and make sure that we can support coaches to do that on a daily basis. As Mark alluded to, sort of a lot happened during as we've looked to get the rugby restarted in the UK, certainly within England, and that's been a collaborative effort across both internally within the RFU and externally with other unions in the UK and government as well, which we'll come on to speak about. But we'll talk tonight a little bit around how we went about that and what we needed to do, and then how we've sort of kept our coaches not just engaged, I think, but also tried to upskill them during this period where they've had opportunities to probably take on more learning than they would have done previously when they're busy out there coaching on the grass. Back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Phil. The other difference between me and Phil is he has pictures of himself with famous people. I don't, unfortunately. Right. So this is just a recap for those of you that were with us last week. But I think what we need to do is sort of try and put our coaching hat on with these. So much of it is the same. And I'll go through this very quickly. But you'll see where this sort of links back, as Phil says, into the sort of coaching world. So just as a reminder from last week, we've had to work really closely with our government, and we've had to I guess sort of dance to their tune, because they've been the ones who have been doing the research, the health, the work on the health of the nation and all those sorts of things as a result of COVID. And it's been really challenging, and there's been no single pathway through it. We've had to go through all sorts of routes to get there, and because it's been unprecedented, and we know that's the same right across Europe, right across the world, isn't it? And from a coaching perspective, it's been probably more challenging than anything, because coaching, of course, can be really hands-on. So how we try and get that guidance from government to help us do things the way we do things has been really challenging, as we outlined last week. So that's the first one. The second thing, remember what we did was we've tried to focus all the way throughout this on keeping our players, not only our players, also our coaches, referees, volunteers safe. So keeping them safe in terms of infection rates and all those sorts of things, as well as keeping them safe in returning to rugby in a safe way when they've had a lot of time away from the game. And also really thinking about retention as well. Remember that I talked last week about those are our guiding principles. We're trying to make sure as many players who were playing in March 2020 are getting back to playing in September 2021. So that whole piece around retention is really important as well. We've done a lot of work that has gone and sat on the shelf, I think I said last week. So plans for different scenarios. How do we get back to rugby? How do we work with government? What could we do in terms of facilities, indoor, outdoor, all those sorts of things? And much of that we've never implemented, because we were trying to work in a way which meant that we had plans in place, but of course in the hope that we didn't have to use them because we'd get back to rugby. So we've taken lots of different routes, and we've got a lot of things actually ready should we have to go back into lockdowns and things like that from this point on. And the second thing on that one around scenarios is we've actually learned that we can be far more nimble, much quicker in making decisions about the game than we have in the past as well. I think I highlighted that last week as one of the real benefits and learnings for us as a sport. This next one, you'll remember, this is really key in terms of coaching and coaches. Our roadmap. So we very early on, we tried to specify what our route from being in total lockdown, no one able to do anything from our government, to get to a point of back to playing full contact rugby across all the ages, etc. What was going to be our journey to get there? And having a roadmap like this really helped. And just a reminder, this was a very early version of the roadmap when we were still at our stage B of that, and we were just coming back into being able to do some activity with limited groups, etc. And Phil will talk a little bit about this and some of the things that we tried to help our coaches with in one, understanding the roadmap, but two, applying it, so making it actually happen out there with their players. And that's, been hugely challenging for them and for us as well. But we did get to the point where we had our final green roadmap, where we've gone through now, and we are now back playing the game as of the start of our season at the beginning of this month. And our roadmap has been really welcomed by the game, and particularly by coaches, because it's been the framework that they've had to be able to do what they need to do now, but also to see where they're going, which has been a really important part of it as well. So if I just, you remember last week I talked around consistency and regulation, and we learnt very early on that we needed to think about the different parts of the game differently. And that's really because some of the things that, as you all know, that our coaches deal with under 18 players is very different from some of the things you deal with over 18 players and with adult players. So we had different guidance and focus, but we always made sure we communicated that at the same time. So we were very consistent in how we gave the messages to the game, but we were also careful to make sure it was applicable to their part of the game as well. And Phil and I worked very closely, for example, on what happened during our off season with a group of real experts from within the union as well, to do that around the age grade game, making sure we were helping people on that progression back. And then just the final one is a really important one that Phil will talk about in much more detail than me, is how we actually communicated and the messages that we gave. And just a reminder, we did a lot of things, tried to create things that were very clear and supportive that people could pick up and use. We did a lot online, webinars, etc. And Phil will talk about that in more detail, particularly for coaches. And we kept information coming on a very regular basis as well. And again, our coaches really valued that more than any other group, actually, because it was helping them back to what they were trying to do, as they were dealing with all these different layers of development, technical skill development that they were able to do at different stages. So that went down really well with the coaches. And then the final bit was just some of what Dave covered last week. And none of this came as a surprise. These were the messages that players gave us in our player surveys. And what we've tried to do is try and re-emphasize these with coaches as much as possible. And many of these are the things that aren't necessarily the technical piece of coaching. It's more your role as a mentor or pastoral part of your coaching, isn't it? It's not about what happens actually with a skill on the pitch. It's how you deal with and attract and engage players back. So we've learned a lot from the surveys that have given us. And again, a lot of what Phil and the team have put together has been brilliant in addressing, what our players are telling us. Remember, we talked last week about certain parts of the game where there's a real challenge we're finding now. Players aren't coming back, and how do we as coaches try and attract them back when they're worried about coming back to the game, or what they have done in the last 18 months hasn't really switched them on to rugby again as much as they wanted. So the role of the coach in a non-technical side we're finding is just as important as the technical side as well, because of what our players are after. So I'll hand over to Phil, who can talk in more detail, and then of course if there's any questions, please put them in the chat. Phil, do you want to take charge of the presentation, or do you want to just shout to me when? Oh, you're on mute, Phil, I think.
Sorry. Classic, sorry. Yeah, I'll just shout you to move on if that's okay, Mark. I just think it'll be easier for consistency.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think as Mark alluded to, so just to give you some context around where we came from in terms of having to engage both coaches and getting the game restarted as we went through. And as Mark alluded to earlier, the government's restrictions were really clear from us. And this diagram on the slides deck at the moment, I know there's lots of boxes you probably can't read at the moment, but just focusing on those sort of green, amber and red boxes in terms of the colours. This was produced to us by some experts in the medical field, working with government, and what they did was they assessed the risk of transmission in certain activities. Green transmission, sort of activity would be really low risk and would be allowed to take place. Then we got to amber activity, which a certain amount of that is okay, so a little bit, but not a lot. And then red activity, which is just not allowed, was just not going to be allowed by government whatsoever. So obviously the first part of lockdown, when the whole country's locked down, this didn't apply. This was sort of in the making as we started to come out of that first lockdown. So what we had to do is, looking at our sport, we had to get footage analysed through analysts and look at the amount of what we would call incidents within the game and what category they would fall into. Would they fall into the green category, the amber category, or the red category? And what that allowed us to do, that took an extensive period of time from some really dedicated analysts to do that. What that allowed us to do was paint the picture of what activity we could start to return as quickly as possible. As you may know, coaches all here, we all want to get out on the grass. We all love coaching. That's why we do it. So we want to get out there. We want to be coaching all aspects of the game to support our players. So part of this was sort of managing the coaches' enthusiasm as well. They've just been locked up for a period of time, not being able to do some of that cool stuff that they've been doing, and want to get back out there. So we had to manage that a little bit as well. What we came up with was that all the incidents in the game, the major two incidents that we had was the scrum and the maul, which was red activity. So scrum and maul were the two activities within the game, two sort of incidents within the game that we knew were causing us, were going to cause us problems in terms of return as a sport. Obviously, they're massively integral parts of the game, but we had two options as an organisation. We've got, do we wait until red activity doesn't exist anymore, or do we try to make some adaptations where we can get people doing activity or a certain part of rugby activity without doing scrum and maul? And that's the decision we took. The first instance that was to go into a non-contact format of the game, and I'm sure many of you on the call will all play touch rugby in different guises. What we have certainly within England is the touch rugby that we play. We have another sport over here as well, rugby league, which I know some is starting to grow in Europe as well. So the skill sets within touch rugby are often leading to players playing the ball before contact. So everything happens before there's any contact, and they decelerate into a touch. And what we didn't know is we didn't know how long we were going to have to play non-contact rugby for. What we didn't want was players to develop skill sets where they're now only playing in front of the defence, and they're decelerating into contact, because as we all know, in rugby union we can play pre, during and post contact. So we wanted to try and see how could we replicate some of these actions, some of these skill sets that we wanted the players to have. How could we do that with? Sorry, someone's waiting in the lobby. That's cool. How could we do that whilst trying to obviously keep non-contact rugby? So what we did was, and this is a really quick turnaround, we came up with a game that we kind of had already in terms of 2-touch. So first touch that you can continue running, second touch you must stop and present the ball. But what we did was we made that, although we may have it as a little training game or training aid that coaches could use, we made that our go-to game, certainly within the age grade game, and then pushing that towards the adult game as well to get the game restarted. And we call that Ready for Rugby. And I think Mark shared some of that resource last week. So if you want to drop back into that and have a look at what that looked like. But ultimately, the aim was to get people out there playing some sort of gameplay activity really quickly, but also still practicing the skill sets that they would use in the game of rugby union. We knew we couldn't do scrum and maul, so we knew we had to take those out, but some of the other skill sets within the sort of ball carry, defence, and we really encouraging the touch had to be sort of around that sort of midriff area, so the belly button navel area. We were looking at that for the touch to get players to simulate that they were going in to make a tackle. So we're again practicing players adjusting body height, even though they're not making tackles, so they're not losing that skill set. And that was really, really important for us. And it wasn't everyone's ideal game initially to start with. I think it's fair to say, Mark. There was some challenge, there was some pushback a little bit, but I think as people started to understand the rationale behind what we were trying to do, they started to understand why we were pushing this 2-touch game and why it was so important to get players back up and running. I'll come on a little bit more about the training in a second, but I'll just want to continue really with sort of gameplay and how we move that forward. The second part of this challenge was we had obviously our professional game returned after that first lockdown, but that obviously came with some with testing, which was very, very expensive, and we couldn't roll that out to the community game. So whilst the professional game started, and they took a long period of time to build in, I think it was around an 8 to 10 week period that they needed to sort of get themselves ready and back into preparation to play. We didn't have that opportunity to test players regularly to make activity happen, so we had to find different ways again to do that. One of the other challenges was that we have our women's premiership game, and what we did was we came up with a new set of rules within that did have some scrum and maul, but they were reduced. So things like a knock-on was no longer a scrum, for example. A forward pass was no longer a scrum. So what it did was it went on average from around, I think it was 18 to 20 scrums per game. In the Women's Premiership the season before, we went to between 3 to 4 scrums per game. So the players were still getting some of that opportunity to scrummage, but we were reducing the risk of face-to-face contact. One of the other things we did within that as well, again approved by World Rugby, was that you could only drive the ball in the 22-metre areas. So at either end of the pitch, so in your own 22-metre area if you were defending, or the attacking 22-metre area to score. So mauls weren't allowed to be set up. If they were set up in general play, the referee just blew the whistle and stopped play. So that's how we sort of offset that. And then when we came to the community game, even to reduce it, even to apply those rules at that moment in time, because the women's game was classed as semi-elite and they were doing some form of minimal testing. In the community game, we were going to have no testing, so government wouldn't allow us to even implement those rules into our game. So what we had to do then was we had to come up with, okay, we were faced with a choice of, do we play a game without scrums and mauls, or do we wait and do we wait for scrums and mauls to be permitted? And we didn't know how long that was going to take, and we thought we were really close on numerous occasions to getting those over the line, and then suddenly there was a spike in cases in the UK, and that changed really, really quickly for us. So the decision was made to again go to World Rugby and approach them to sanction a variation of the game which had no scrums and no mauls whatsoever. So that would be a free kick would come in place for any knock-on. Any offence that was a scrum would now be replaced by a free kick. And mauls would just not be permitted. So if you formed a maul, it would be a penalty to the opposition. So if you were attacking and you formed a maul by sort of player binding onto the ball carrier into the tackle and going forward, you would be penalised and the ball would be turned over. Likewise, if you tried to hold a player up you will be penalised. When you do things like this, one of the big learnings for us is you write all the rules down on a piece of paper and you start and you go through them all and you think you've sorted it. And then someone somewhere asks a question and it's just an unintended consequence you haven't thought of. So there's something that if you do this, something else will always happen. So for example, if you take scrums and mauls out the game, suddenly there's a higher number of tackles within the game. So suddenly then the risk of injury can start to increase. So we had those types of challenges that we had to be aware of when we were monitoring this and making those changes. So we had to make people aware that actually the game may be faster because there's no reset scrums, etc. There's no mauls, so the game could be faster as well. So we have to make sure we offset some of those challenges around player welfare as well. So making sure that we made coaches and players aware of this. Reducing game time was big on that as well. Could we reduce the overall game time to allow the number of tackles to be something similar that they would experience over an 80-minute game, but potentially over a 60 or 70-minute game instead. So these were all things that we had to think about. You know, players running really hard from 10 meters on a free kick, what was certainly within the age grade game, started to cause us some problems. And again, that comes with how it's coached. And we were trying to incentivize people to make passes beforehand, etc. as well. So using that influence as well as regulation to try and move that on. So we made the decision to do that, and we got some games played at the sort of the end of last season. We managed to get some games played against opposition, competitive games. In around about, I think it was about a 5-week window, wasn't it, Mark? 4 to 5 week window, we managed to get games played. And again, that work had been done, as Mark said, for a long period of time previously, but we'd just gone back into lockdown. And what we had to do with coaches as well is we couldn't just say we're coming out of lockdown, you can start playing this game straight away. We always set ourselves a window of opportunity where we would say we would make sure that players were being coached and conditioned to get back into a physical and mental state where they will be able to perform the actions needed in the game safely and effectively. Mark, just want to move the slide on. I think have you gone past one, Mark, or was that the next one? That's it. Perfect. Thank you. So what we did was, when you change the game, we then were really mindful we have to change what training looks like for that as well. So we had to put some guidance in and some regulation in a little bit around what you could and couldn't do in training as well. So we, as Mark alluded to, we produced lots of documentation, but one of the biggest things we did was little infographics like this. So one page where this is, when it comes to contact rugby, these are the main things that you should do. So breaking those areas down, the tackle, what you can do at the ruck, the line out, etc., and then no scrum and no maul. This is what you can't do, these things. So really simple snapshots that coaches could go to and go, I know I can't do this. I know I'm allowed to do this. So making that really clear within that guidance. It created, again, probably the training guidance was harder than the match guidance, if I'm being honest, because every coach in England wanted to have their opinion. And one of the challenges I'm sure you all face is within sport is we come out from two ends of the spectrum in England. One was, we're not doing enough as a sport because football can continue and we can't. Okay, yeah, but football is definitely a different sport, so we have to think about that, and people just couldn't see that at that moment in time. And then there's the other people at the other extremes where probably government was listening to a little bit more is, I can't go and see my family members, but you're going to allow people to go and play rugby on a grass pitch. And they were making a lot of noise to government, which made government feel uncomfortable about what we were and weren't allowed to do. So again, within the training, we had to be really clear around what that looked like. And within that, what we did was we introduced some real clear steps that we kept in place throughout the whole roadmap process, really. So things like you couldn't do more than 15 minutes activity without having to break and sanitize. So allowing people to go and clean the equipment, clean their hands, etc. 15 minutes was chosen because from the medical experts that we'd spoken to within government, they were saying that 15 minutes was about the maximum contact time you should have around COVID before having to sanitize. So we went with that. One of the other things we did was we brought in contact really incrementally. So we drip fed, we really slowly brought contact back. So that started with, you were only able to do 1v1 tackling, working in real small areas. You could only do that for around 10 minutes maximum throughout the session. And as soon as you've done any contact whatsoever, you must go and sanitize straight away and clean and sanitize straight away. This included equipment as well. So what we tried to do was, as we said here, we didn't want people going using scrub machines as an option because they could be easily transmissible as well. So we did some of that work. And also we wanted to reduce, like, you know, a tackle, but we made things like using tackle shields become we didn't ban them, we didn't say you couldn't do them, but what we did was we made it a little bit harder for you to use them because we knew that if people didn't clean them regularly, there'd be a source of infection. So we asked them to clean them after every player had used one, which obviously would really disrupt the session. And kind of the thinking behind that was, if you need to use them, because we know if you've got numbers or you've got a player that's lacking confidence, you might need to use them. So we didn't want to outlaw them. But we also found that actually, if we can incentivize not to use them, that will probably be better and safer within that equipment piece. And then other things just like not sharing water bottles, etc. If you just want to move on one, Mark. Thank you. So again, as we said, what we did was we just really simple. This is what you can do. This is what you can't do. No sort of grey areas. Did people always listen? No, we got some feedback that actually people were doing things they shouldn't have been doing, but we were really clear on that, and they got sanctioned and spoken to by our disciplinary committee. We really came down on that really hard, because at the end of the day, it was putting our sport at risk. And if people are seeing we're not following the guidance, the government could just have shut us down as a sport, and we didn't want to take that risk. The other thing we brought in was, as we said, we gradually moved that contact time up to a maximum of 20 minutes. So what that means is that any contact, so tackle, ruck, maul, line out, etc., had to be within that 20-minute period of contact, and that was per session. So per player, per session. So a lot of the time it was just seen as managing that 20 minutes. If you felt a player, you know, needed to, for example, if you were playing a contact game for 20 minutes, but you've got a player who stood out on the wing and made one tackle in 20 minutes, they've not had 20 minutes of contact. So we kind of gave them some opportunities to say, if you're seeing that, why don't you do some more shortened activity with that player to give them some more opportunity to practice that tackling, etc., within that 20-minute period, or sorry, outside of that 20-minute period, but within the 20-minute period as a player. Hopefully that makes sense. So the game may have gone on for 20 minutes of contact, but some players would have had very minimal contact in that. And we were giving coaches the opportunity to identify that and work with them in a smaller group later on to be able to just make sure they're still getting some of that practice that they need. And actually, it was really a good exercise at highlighting to coaches what they miss sometimes when they're just focusing on coaching a gameplay session. So I'm just coaching the gameplay session. I'm managing the game. I'm probably refereeing it at some point as well as a coach. But am I noticing the players who aren't involved in and not getting the repetitions of the skill or the action that we're trying to do? And it allowed coaches to sort of observe that a little bit better. So there has been some benefits to this as we go through. What we've done is we've kind of kept that 20 minutes in now, even though we're back to full rugby. We've kept that in our guidance as we believe it's the right thing to do. As we work through player load, you know, as World Rugby and our professional and professional rugby, certainly within England, is looking at reducing contact time for players around player load. We're keeping that 20 minutes in as a guidance per session. We believe that within 20 minutes of a session, you should be, you know, if you're doing one session a week, 2 sessions a week, example, 20 minutes should be adequate to cover the things you need to cover if you're playing games on the weekend as well around that load. So we're keeping that in for the foreseeable future, and we'll keep emphasising that with coaches. The other challenge we had as we did return was players coming back in and being really, really enthusiastic. So now we can ruck and we can go contest the breakdown. Fantastic. So you've got players. What we were seeing were players coming in from the side because they were just so excited to be able to do that, and their energy was just so high. So we had to be really clear with coaches that we had to manage that because there was a real risk of injury, not because people were being malicious or wanting to injure someone. They were just really, really excited, and we had to make sure coaches were aware of that as well. So coaches needed to be aware that actually stopping the practice, making sure we didn't get players into bad habits, and always referring, as we'll talk about next week with the referees, always referring to the picture the referee would want to see. So we use that phrase a lot with our coaches. Can you make sure the players are aware of the picture the referee wants to see, and how we show that we're seeing that in training as well? Because if we're not, they're potentially going to get into some bad habits, and it could risk some injury within the game. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There was a lot. It sounds like it all happened nice and succinctly, but it didn't. There was lots of late night phone calls and early morning phone calls to try and work this. And again, as I say, you know, one of the things we did was we did a lot of planning and scenarios setting of what if. I think it's fair to say we didn't probably do that straight away at the start. But as we started to unpick it, we thought we had one solution, hence why the roadmap looked like it did when Mark put the first one up, and then how it looked at the end. It changed so much because we knew we had to then scenario plan for every eventuality. And, you know, we could need to do that again, as Mark referenced, coming back, who knows. But I think the clear thing for us was giving the guidance to coaches that this is what we need you to do. This is how best to do it. Still giving them some autonomy to be able to do things themselves, or be able to coach in the way you want to coach, but saying you can do that, but within these really probably tighter guidelines than we've ever done before. And I think one of the opportunities that has given us, that this has given us is, and whether this will be a bonus or a negative thing moving forward, who knows, but what it did do is it made coaches come and find that information from us. So we engaged with coaches more than we'd ever done, because coaches wanted to know what they could and couldn't do. And first and foremost, we were the people who could tell them what it was, the governing body. So in other times they'll go and bypass us to find information, but actually it opened up some huge channels for us to be able to communicate directly to the game and say, we've got this information for you here, and we are here to support you doing it, and we're here to help you. Some coaches were really nervous. And rightly so, right, nervous about coaching a game that's different to where potentially their skill sets are. So some people who were really good at coaching the scrum or really good at coaching the maul, really nervous around how that might do it. But we tried to offset that with, and again, as we came back, what we did was we focused really hard on them developing the player to be ready for the game. And Mark, if you just want to move on to the next slide. So as I said, we had game adaptations, we had no scrum, we had no maul. We used the Premier 15s as a sort of a trial in terms of how they used their rules, and actually the game to watch was fantastic, and it got some really good viewing figures. So it certainly showed us a way that the game could be played if we wanted to as well. So it gave us some great feedback and analysis that we would never have got previously. But as I said, that when these X's get removed and we can start to play them again, there's an even bigger challenge for us, and that is players who haven't scrimmaged, haven't mauled, haven't made contact for a large period of time with or played the game of rugby for a large period of time, longer than they've ever done before in terms of an off season. Mark, if you just want to move on. So we spoke with our strength and conditioning coaches, and we came up with this principle, which was called the FIT principle. And we really, really sort of worked hard on this with our coaches. So we kind of said, if you're designing a session and you're returning players, these are the things you need to start to think about. So the F, as it says there on the screen, is frequency. How often are you training? So if you've not trained for 18 months or for a year, if you haven't trained for a year and your players are coming back in and you're doing an hour and a half session or a 90-minute session, at high intensity, you're going to break players. So think about how often you train. Do you train 3 times a week? Well, actually, do you bring them back once a week because they haven't trained to start with? So first of all, frequency. And one of the other things we talked about here was finding out what the players were doing themselves. So what have your players been doing over lockdown? Can you have them conversations? What we found was there was probably 2 extremes. I think it's fair to say, Mark, isn't it? There was the people who had done absolutely nothing, sat there, and adult players drinking beer, eating lots of takeaway foods and not doing much activity, to people who'd actually gone and done a lot of, used it as an opportunity to lose weight, get fit, go out and run a lot because they felt it was an opportunity to get outside. And same with age grade players as well, wasn't there? There was a real imbalance of what, and mix that with the age grade players of they've all had 12 months of growing differently as well. So players coming back in completely different physical shape, physical height, and they've grown, but not normally as they grow during that period, they're doing sport, whether that be in school, whether that be in clubs, and they hadn't had any of that. So they'd grown, but not worked out how to use their body in a sporting context because they'd not had opportunity to. So there was lots of moving parts within that. So frequency, finding out what your players had done. The other thing with that as well was when players had done activity, everything they'd be doing was running in a straight line pretty much. So it would be cycling, running, everything would be sort of a straight line motion, very little change of direction, etc. So we had to be really mindful of that in a multi-directional sport and a multi-height operating sport as well. So how often you're training, think about that, introduce it gradually, then look at the intensity you train at. So what we did was we kind of went back to the original team sport framework, and we talked about green, amber, red in terms of our intensity. Green intensity being really low, amber being moderate, and then red being high intensity. So thinking about, can you plan in your sessions when you're going to be low intensity, when you're going to be amber, and when you're going to be red in high. Again, we wanted coaches to be really clear about planning this, because what we didn't want is them to just go into a session and there'd be large periods of high intensity that they hadn't planned for or hadn't controlled. So it was really planning out what your activity is and managing that intensity that players are working in. Short and sharp, high intensity, but still giving them some high intensity, and then longer periods of that lower intensity. The type of activity, so not always going straight back into full rugby. So can we play some more multi-sport games, catch, pass, move around, dodge, etc. Even for our adult players, can we get them doing things, core stability, core functional, what we would call core functional movement work, burr walks, sort of hinging, squat motions, that all exercises that would develop them. And we did a lot of this with our trying to integrate our front row players back. So what we said was, if you play in front row, think about doing some exercises that will help you with your posture, body positioning, etc. You can't scrummage, but what you can do is work on some of these flexibility, range of motion, range of movements within your lower back area, within your legs, your hips, your groins, etc. that may not only benefit you in terms of injury prevention when we come out of this, but make you ready to scrummage quicker. So we tried to follow that process. So looking at what type it is and not always just rugby activity. And then the time, how long the sessions are. So gradually increasing the sessions, but timing the actual activity within the sessions as well. So getting coaches to really focus on timing and planning and timing how long players were active for. We spoke earlier about the 15 minutes. So we needed to plan that for 15 minutes, but we talked about if you're doing high intensity, timing that and stopping it, not just because we're seeing, stopping it on the time, not just because we want to see a little bit more from our players, being really strict on that, because we knew that there would be some people who would potentially go back too fast, too quickly, doing all the rugby activity. And then we know with players who have been back working, not done any rugby for a long period of time, and then within 2 weeks they're injured and can't do any more rugby again. And that's what we wanted to avoid. And we kind of used the gym analogy that when the gyms reopened in the UK, there was always going to be the people who'd go every day for the first week, and then probably not go for the next 2 weeks because they couldn't move their body. And then it was sort of that analogy. So can we make sure we're only going once or twice in that first week, and then we can continue to go once or twice and maybe 3 times on the third week, etc., and build it, that really gradual build it up. So that was one of the key things, and again, we've kept this within our sort of guidance for coaches around planning sessions, that you should always think about this FIT principle when planning your sessions. And linked to that, what we said was planning your sessions in a minimum of 3. So you always know what's gone before and you know what's coming next. So there's some joined up approach within that as well. So that's kind of where we got to in terms of supporting our coaches. And there was other things in there that we did to do that. We ran, which I'll come on to in a second, we ran lots of these type of webinars with our coaches, and we would have thousands of people on at times, asking questions, wanting to know more, giving them that guidance and support. We used social media a lot to promote this. And that's, as you will know, social media, it generates both positive and negative feedback all the time, but some of the negative feedback helped us shape a little bit of where we went to as well. So it's like, okay, maybe we haven't thought that one through properly, or did we communicate that one really well enough? So it was a really good challenge for us to think about how we did things. But yeah, these little models that we came up with and the little diagrams were probably the most important things. And we did some video animations like Mark put in the box around Ready for Rugby, just to try and give coaches that sort of real clear, concise things to sort of hang your hat on and use, really things they could just pick up from us straight away, like this FIT principle. I can pick this up straight away and I can implement it. I can plan my sessions and implement it that way. Mark, if you just want to move on. So as I said, we use lots of webinars to do that. And at the start of lockdown, what we saw was a real spike from people like commercial providers, etc., doing lots and lots of webinars really quickly in that first 1, 2, 3 weeks as lockdown came in the UK. And we kind of looked at that and we took a step back and we said, okay, we're not going to rush into this. We're going to do it. We're going to do it right. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. We're not just going to get content out for the sake of getting content out. So we kind of bided our time a little bit and we allowed the sort of the spike in webinars to take place. We was like, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to do quality, not quantity. So we're going to try and keep our coaches engaged for as long as possible, but we're going to give them something they want to come to all the time. So obviously we're lucky within our union. You know, we had access to our professional performance coaches. They were obviously not coaching at the time, so it gave us an opportunity to connect. And it also gave us opportunity to connect with other people around the world as well, in terms of the coaches not coaching. So we could actually go and find more information and learn. So what we did was we put in a slot, and we'll talk a bit more about this next week with the referees as well, on a Tuesday evening when most clubs would usually be training. What we did was we put a webinar on, but we did that alternating between coaches and match officials. So there was never 2 coaching webinars one week after the next. There was always a coaches one, then there'd be a referees one, and we kind of like the gaps got bigger in between those as well, as we spaced them out to make sure they're quality and not quantity. So we were really, really fortunate to have access to people like Eddie Jones that said there, Simon Amor, who was coaching the England attack at the time, John Mitchell, who was coaching the defence, and then we also was very lucky to get our former head coach Stuart Lancaster involved as well, who actually contacted us and said, I'm really keen to do some stuff and help out. I want to engage with coaches. I want to support them. If you see the numbers there, they're on average the numbers that we were getting for the webinars on the evening to engage with coaches. So Eddie Jones, 2,300. Stuart did 2 for us, averaging over 2,000 on both, so a total of 4,000. 1,600 for Simon, 1,600 for Simon Amor, and about 1,900, 1,900 for John Mitchell, which was linked to actually John had done a resource for us pre World Cup in 2019, which we coincided with releasing at that moment in time. All the links for these, I think Mark's just put that in the chat. All the links for these we will provide you with post this. So we'll send them out via Marissa, so you can access these yourselves, register and watch them. There's some really, really good stuff in there. We also, as England Rugby, produced a podcast with Eddie where he would get a bit of a coaching conversation with himself and Conor O'Shea, who's our performance director. And within that, then the second series of that, we actually started to get other coaches involved in them podcasts as well. So Justin Langer, the Australian head cricket coach, came involved. And this sort of within the matter of a couple of months, this podcast went to number 2 behind one of the most famous football podcasts in the UK. So it was really, really successful for us, and a great way again of us getting some really in-depth learning conversations out to our coaches. What we then had to do was, what we were really mindful was just saying, okay, you've learnt all this in lockdown, you've got all this information, you've listened to some of the best coaches in the world, you've had access to, you've asked questions of some of the best coaches in the world. How are you going to translate that into coaching your team? What does that look like for you? So we did some work with coaches around translating learning into practice when we get back on the grass. What we didn't want is everyone picking something that Eddie had said, something Stuart had said, something John had said, and then go and try and implement that all in one go to their players who are just coming back from rugby from a point of they've not been involved for a long period of time. So we worked really, really hard with our coaches to say, here's some information, try and identify 1 or 2 key points that you're going to work on in your coaching based on some of the learning that you've seen. 1 or 2 points. Stuart did some stuff on attack and defence for us. Stuart's the only ones that aren't on demand because he used some of his own footage that we don't have the rights to. But he did some stuff on attack and defence. So what are them things, key technical and tactical things would you bring in into your team play, for example? So getting them to really focus on that within that learning. So making sure it wasn't just a nice to do, sit there taking lots of information in, but also how you translate that practically into your coaching. Again, social media has been used for us. Every time we moved a stage on the roadmap, we did webinars to try and support coaches, ask questions. Myself and Mark's been on many of those. You know, we're probably 25, 30 minutes mark where we're answering questions at times. And it's not, they were always coming from a good place, really. Yeah, as coaches, as we know, we like to push the boundaries. So we're always double checking, but can I do this? Can I do that? So wanting to sort of push the boundaries, but we always, we work really hard with that communication, and what it's led us to do is actually recognise that this is the best way to communicate with our coaches in the game. We can't get out and speak to them all, but what we can do is we can provide a message to them that's consistent. That's one message, not me saying it at one half of England and Mark saying it in the second half of England. It's a consistent message that we're both delivering, or one of us is delivering and Mark's delivering his message consistently, no ambiguity, and anyone can access it at any time. And that's so important. As certainly as the ways of working have changed, because we also found, no longer were people working 9 till 5. People were working 9 till 11, then they were homeschooling for 4 or 5 hours, then they were picking up their work later on at night. So 7 o'clock on an evening might not have been a very good time for them to watch a webinar, but actually on demand they could go in, register, and then watch it back whenever it suited them. And that was the beauty of what we did. So it's been a massive step change in how we certainly provide our key messages and core message into the game, certainly within coaches. Will it always work? I think we've seen a little bit of a drop off now, if I'm being honest, as coaches have got back up and into running. So we've seen a little bit of a drop off in that engagement. But what we're going to do is we're going to be really persistent, and this is the way forward. We believe it's the right way to do it. We're going to keep that messaging coming. This is going to be the format you're doing. If you want the messaging from us as the governing body, this is what and the union, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. So it may take a little bit of work in progress over the coming year to do that. But if we can make sure that all our key messages are promoted that way and done that way, and the questions are asked that way, I think that will continue that engagement with coaches that we have. And once we've got that engagement, we can start to not influence them is the wrong word, but support them in their practice, influence them to be more critical thinkers, influence them to think differently and find other information. I think that's anything else that I think you think I've missed, Mark, or is that pretty? I'm conscious I've talked for a long period of time there.
No, that's all good, Phil. Thanks. Yeah, good stuff. It's just whether, Jens, there's any questions. I don't think there's any in there yet, but clearly we're happy to take them.
I've just put one in there now. It was just, if it's a lot, I could good work you guys have been doing in terms of trying to retain your coaches through these webinars and whatever else you have arranged. And have you actually managed them? I mean, maybe that was what you alluded to in the end there, but I get the sense you've managed to retain most of your coaches this way. Or have you been struggling a bit like the rest of? I think coming back now, I think we are facing a bit of a challenge in terms of community rugby that people are just get so busy. So I think they want to be, involved and keep involved in rugby, but sometimes, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on at the moment. How do you see that, and what do you do to work towards retaining all the people you want to get back in the game?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. We have all the answers? No, there will be some that have fell away. The majority, I would say, we have kept, and I think we have done that through purely just by keeping communicating with them, whether that be on social media, whether that be on through the medium of webinar or just through newsletters and interactions. We've worked really, really hard to keep that communication channel open and saying to them, tell us what you want to hear, like what is your biggest challenges, and then helping us shape that. So I think we have managed to keep a lot of them, I would say. I think the challenge now will be moving forward, as Mark alluded to, I think, and Dave would probably have done last week. Yeah, we are seeing a slower return in some certain demographics or certain areas of the game. The challenge will be is supporting the coaches to think differently about how they approach that. And we will have some really good coaches who are really strong in the technical and tactical side of the game. But actually, at this moment in time, for some of them age groups, it's the sort of, people call them the softer skills, but I actually think they're the harder skills. They're the hard skills of building relationships and communicating with people effectively in a way that they want to be communicated as well. And we may have some work to do to support some of our coaches who are excellent technical tacticians and can coach the technical and tactical aspects of the game really well, but don't have a less strong in them relationship building. And it's not natural for some people to be like that. We have to accept that, but we have to try and support them in recognising that if we don't do this. And I think the other thing for me is around coaches, we have to open their eyes a little bit. Mark will probably be able to tell you more on this than me, but from what I see, some of our coaches are quite territorial. So they keep everyone. I've got, Mark, I saw a comment the other day where someone said, oh, we're really struggling for players at our age group in our team. And the next comment is, well, I've got 40 players. Well, that's fantastic. And that's really, really good. But we've got to open coaches' eyes to see that them 40 players won't have anyone to play if we continue to have that mentality, because the teams are struggling. So we have to get coaches to think bigger picture. Okay, how can I integrate some of that coach who's really struggling locally down the road? How can we work with them to make a fixture take place? So I've got my 14, he might have 10 or 12, or she might have 10 or 12. How can I make sure that we're getting 52 people to play rugby rather than just 40 scratching around to find a fixture? And actually, the women's game has probably been the strongest one to return for us out of all of them. The women's game has been the one, and we're working really hard to make sure that the coaching in the women's game is going to be as strong as it can be to make sure we retain as many of them players as possible.
I can see we've got one. Daniel's asked a question. This is probably one for you as well, Phil. How can we measure the future impact on technical skills? Daniel, do you mean the lack of rugby recently and how we're trying to reintroduce?
Yeah.
Yeah, again, we've tried to use coaches as this because we don't see every player. So we've tried to get coaches to think about what is it you need to see in them players before they can move on to that. I think people use the computer game analogy a lot, don't they? You know, what threshold do you have to pass before you can move on to that next level? And we worked really, really hard with coaches to say, when the players are coming back, they're not all going to come back at the same rate. So as we talked about the different physical attributes that they have, the different things they'll have been doing. So I think one of the biggest learnings for coaches has been around how to tailor or how to sort of specify certain sessions to meet everyone's needs. So one player who's really struggling with the contact at one end of the spectrum, how can I make sure that they're getting really good practice and activity, whilst the player who's been doing a lot of work in lockdown, who's ready to move on to the next bit, how can I work my sessions and plan to meet everyone's needs? So that's been a big challenge within that. So I think what the consequence of that, again, Daniel, would be that coaches are now being more aware of what key things they're looking for in players during that them certain technical aspects of the game, which they may not have done before. So they would have put every player through the same practice and hoped for the best. And they'd have all come out the other side with different varying levels, but there would have been very little personal coaching within that. So I think one of the benefits of this is, again, just raising the awareness of the technical skills that coaches can observe and start to see. I'm actually looking for that now, because I've had to, over the past 6 months if we've come back, I've had to look at, is that player ready to go and play a game? Is that player ready to now make a contact on a ball carrier that's running? Example, so that they've had to look at those things. In terms of the technical aspect, the long-term technical aspect, I think one of the things we're seeing is scrummaging will be one where sort of the impact, the neck strength, something that players couldn't do. We were very lucky to have speak to Ellis Genge, one of the England international front row players, who talked about how he found it very difficult to return because of his neck strength, etc. when he came back, and he talks a lot about how he can support players to think about that. And it's not, I think what people see on TV sometimes, they see these athletes go out and they think it's been a nice easy road for them back, and they're probably experiencing a lot of what our community players are experiencing now, but probably just in a different way. So I think scrummaging will be one where, and we're being really, really clear with our clubs and our coaches, is if people aren't ready, use adaptations, use uncontested if you need to, how make the game as safe as possible and help reintegrate players back. As we said, there's always a tendency when you've not had something, you know, it's like when you're on a diet, isn't it? When you've not had sugary foods or fatty foods, when you first go to have them again, and when you come off your diet or you have a treat day or whatever, you want them all. You can't pick which one you want. And it's a little bit like that. I think when you've had something taken away from you that you enjoyed doing, or was possibly one of your strengths. So scrummaging would be one thing, you know, certain positions would be a strength of theirs, and they struggle to see their value maybe in the rest of the game. But actually, this is something I'm really, so I want to get back into it as quickly as possible. Where actually we've got to really be incremental and support people to get back in there gradually, so they've got build that passion again, build that love, build that enjoyment, build that enjoyment of a contest again, but not do it in week 1 or week 2. Do it in week 7, week 8, week 9 as we build them players forward. I think that's one thing we're still. And we have to make sure that coaches are being aware of that going through as we develop these.
Excellent.
I think I'll just quickly, sorry, Jens, can I add to that, Phil? I think the question about how do you measure it, Daniel's a good one, actually. I probably feel that's something we have done in the past, but we've always done it with a probably specific aim. What does the game look like and how are players playing it? Maybe we all probably need to think about doing that. How's the game being played generally differently because of what we all went through for almost 2 rugby seasons, isn't it? So it is a good question. And you know, having played non-contact versions of the game more, are players better at some of those skills where they've lost some of the skills they had around contact as well? We would guess that would be the case, but it would be a guess, wouldn't it?
It would 100%. Yeah, again, it's hard to measure, but it's something that's worth measuring, and I think it's a really interesting one there, Mark. Like you say, going back to that analogy, the non-contact stuff, everything we saw from coaches, all the feedback we were getting was the players' handling skills were improving exponentially. They were improving so much. We don't hear as much about that now, and I'm wondering if we don't hear much about that now because they're back coaching all the contact elements of the game and not the handling. I would surmise that's probably where we're at, but yeah, we have to just keep banging that drum.
All right, good. But listen, guys, I think you guys could keep on talking forever. Is my feeling. And I think it's been really interesting to listen to. I don't think there's any more questions here in the end. So, and I think we've used up all the time you've allocated to us. I think at least for me, it was really interesting to hear how you have actually come out of an unfortunate situation with some good takeaways, I guess, and some good learnings. And I guess we can all look back at this and hopefully get some good knowledge out of this. And I for one look forward to see the webinars that you have promised to share here. I think there will be some interesting stuff in here, and I hope, since you're sharing them, that it's okay that we share those across our organization. So,
yeah,
excellent.
definitely.
David, Daniel, do you have anything more to add, or should I just close off the meeting?
No, just want to thank you to Phil, to Mark for all this tremendous work, and of course we will have all the benefit of their work, and we will learn all from their experience, and if we can share this kind of information with all the other unions in Rugby Europe, I think will be excellent. Thank you very much.
All right. But yeah, I guess that's it then. Thanks a lot, guys, for your efforts here. It's been really interesting, and yeah, have a good night, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you so
Cheers.
much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.